What do you believe is the origin of Hanukkah and what does it mean to you?
In my understanding, the Jewish holiday is when we celebrate the national independence of the Jewish people of Israel during the 2nd century BCE and onwards until this autonomy was lost to Rome. Broadly speaking, so as not to go into too much detail, but I think it is a very important episode for humanity. There was a very important king who built an entire empire, Alexander the Great, a Macedonian king who expanded his empire. And what happens is that when he leaves Europe, he arrives in Asia, he arrives in Africa. And here, for the first time, there is a clash between Hellenistic culture, which is like the pillar that supported Western systems of thought, and it collides with the ideas of the Middle East, and much farther, all the way to Asia, Africa, certain areas of Africa. And I think this clash is very significant for the future of humanity. Franz Deutsch, one of the great thinkers from a couple of centuries ago, stated that the West is the product of the heritage of Greece and Israel. Those are the two great pillars, if you think about it on a more philosophical level. But that clash happens with the arrival of the Greco-Macedonians to the land of Israel. He defeats Darius and all that, the Persians, and conquers the land of Israel. After Alexander the Great, there is a dispute over who will be his successor among his generals, known as the Diadochi in Greek, and among these generals, the territories are divided, or the territory that Alexander the Great had conquered is split up, and it breaks apart. And over the centuries, the land of Israel falls under what is known as the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucid Kingdom, right? Because it was from Seleucus, right? From one of these Diadochi, one of Alexander the Great's generals. And what happens? At a certain point in history, the Jews realize that they no longer want to be under Seleucid occupation, and they take advantage of certain, let's say, geopolitical opportunities that were happening. Among the Seleucids who were occupying Israel, and the Jews decide to rebel against this invading empire. And these Jews who rebelled are known as the Maccabees. The Maccabees fight battles to free Judea, which was being occupied by the Seleucids, and they liberate Jerusalem. And that's how they managed to restore the service of the Jerusalem temple, because the Jerusalem temple had been desecrated. And through all this, they managed to purify the temple. And because of that, let's say, liberation of the eternal capital of the Jewish people, which is Jerusalem, this holiday called Hanukkah is celebrated to this day. There are those who say that the miracle of Hanukkah is a small jar of oil that lasted 8 days. In my opinion, that's a minor miracle, right? I'm not saying it didn't happen. In fact, in the book of the Maccabees, it says that the Hanukkiah, not the Hanukkiah, sorry, the Menorah, which is the candelabrum of the temple, they made it with the Shippodim shell barzel, that's like spears, let's say, like metal rods. They tied a base stick and tied a few other sticks, and on top they placed them to light the candles of the temple. And how did they light them? The book of the Maccabees says, with 2 stones, making a spark. That is, oil isn't even mentioned in the books of the Maccabees, which are the source for the story of the oil miracle. It's a later source, that's why from a historical perspective, and also in Jewish sources, it's only mentioned in some later sources. It was seen that the miracle of Hanukkah and the reason for Hanukkah was the liberation of the Jewish people so they could have national independence. That's basically what is celebrated. This idea of national liberation became much more overshadowed after the Bar Kokhba revolt. For those who don't know, he was a Jewish king in the 2nd century. He also tried to rebel against the Roman Empire. Like the Maccabees, they rebelled against the Greeks and Seleucids. Bar Kokhba failed in the revolt against the Romans, unlike the Maccabees who succeeded in their revolt against the Seleucids, and Bar Kokhba was defeated. And the Romans, as I mentioned a little while ago, decimated Israel, decimated the Jewish people, and ended the lives of many people. And I think that the historical trauma was so great that it made the sages of Israel try to quell this desire to launch a revolt to liberate Israel. There were other attempts throughout history to try to reconquer Jerusalem and all these things, but in general, that's why you see in rabbinic literature only very slight mentions of war and battles, that is, in rabbinic literature. if you refer to apocryphal books like the Maccabees and all that, you'll see that the emphasis is on the national aspect, that this is what happened on a historical level. In rabbinic literature, especially the later ones, it's literature that has a more religious focus on Hanukkah, but honestly, it's a national focus, at least from my perspective. Basically, that's what we celebrate in Hanukkah, which is very relevant because the West is a product of this. Think about it. If the Jews hadn't triumphed against the Seleucids, the Jewish people would have ended, they would have assimilated among the Hellenists, and that's it. But that didn't happen. The Jews maintained our identity at that time, and that caused these historical events to reach where we are today. The major religions that originate from Judaism, known as Abrahamic religions and related beliefs, the Western perspective starts because there was a victory by the Maccabees over the Seleucids, over the Greeks.
I would like it if you could help us understand the difference between the Hanukkiah and the Menorah.
It is written, this is also mentioned in the book of the Maccabees. In fact, and in retrospect, a somewhat more midrashic explanation of this event was given. But when the Greeks, yes, the Seleucid Greeks, I'll call them Greeks, let's say, they desecrate the temple in Jerusalem, they take over the temple. What they do, yes, they put up a statue and all that. When they do this, it was during the festival of Sukkot. The festival of Sukkot is a celebration that lasts a week. And when the Maccabees years later, liberate Jerusalem, they have this desire to renew what they hadn't been able to do the last time. And the last festival they couldn't celebrate was Sukkot. So the Maccabees and the Jews, once they liberate the temple, come with palm branches. And they arrive with what is known as etrog, which is like the vegetables, the greens that are used in the festival of Sukkot, which is another festival. And they celebrate the liberation of Jerusalem for a period of 1 week. That's why it is lit. It's the menorah of the temple, which is the menorah, to answer your question. It's the candelabrum that was lit in the temple. This is written in the Torah. It's written in the portion of Beha'alotcha, right? Which is like a candelabrum that has 7 branches, right? 1 in the middle and 3 on each side. This is a frequently cited source. Zechariah quotes it, the candelabrum. There are archaeological records. For example, in Rome, you can see the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. There you see a sculpture of what the candelabrum, the menorah looked like. There are also coins from the Maccabees. There are coins, in fact, that have been found which have the shape of the menorah. There are mosaics. Well, this is the menorah that was in the Temple of Jerusalem. The Maccabees light it because it is a commandment from the Torah. It is written in the Torah that we must light the Ner Tamid, an eternal light. The menorah must remain lit at all times, throughout history. And that's why the first thing they do is look for a way to light the menorah. So this is where the rabbinic sources, the Jewish sources, say that they looked for oil and saw that all the oils had been defiled. And they find an oil that is pure. Yes, the explanation for this is also very interesting from a historical perspective. What makes an oil impure is something called tumato alim, which is impurity of. If there is, for example, a room and there is a dead body in the room, if there are containers with oil, all the containers with oil that are open become impure if there is a dead body. So, but if it is a closed oil container, it does not become impure if it is sealed. So what do we understand here? That the oils that were in the temple were impure. And that's why the menorah couldn't be lit with impure oil. Why were they impure? Because apparently it was due to the dead from the wars against the Greeks. Literally, apparently, the Maccabees fought in the very temple, or at least the Greeks killed Jews in the temple itself, and that made the oils impure. Also, during the Great Revolt, during the Great War against Rome, Josephus writes that the Jews fought to the last drop of blood in the very temple, at the gates of the temple. But getting back to the topic. So, they find a bottle that was sealed and they light the menorah. Tradition says that for 8 days, this small amount of oil lasted for 8 days. So, that's why we light a Hanukkiah. What is the Hanukkiah? It's like the candelabrum. I already put my Hanukkiah there because Hanukkah is almost here, but I would have shown it to you. It's similar to the candelabrum, which has 7 branches. But in order to light 8 candles in memory of the 8 days the oil lasted, we light. We have a menorah. Menorah, a candelabrum with 4 branches. 4 and 4, that's 8. And the one in the middle, which is called the shamash, it's to have the same structure as the menorah. Strictly speaking, I think the oil source matters. The Midrashic teaching is valid and very good, but I think the historical reason it's 8 days is because of the reason I just mentioned, because they wanted to celebrate like Sukkot, which lasted a week. That's why it was lit during the 8 day festival, to remember it as equivalent to the Sukkot festival they missed. There's another perspective that has also been raised historically, and that is, why are candles lit? Because in the time of the Seleucids, the Greeks, they forbade the Jews from performing what is known as the Brit Milah. That's the circumcision of the children. So what did the Jews do when a new child was born? They didn't go to the neighbors and say, hey, there's a new child, come because we're going to perform a Brit Milah. When is the circumcision done? On the 8th day after birth. What did they do? They would light candles. One candle meant the child was 1 day old, two candles, 2 days old, 3 days, and so on. And when the 8 days were completed, there were no more candles. So, in remembrance of this atmosphere of rebellion against the impositions of the Seleucid Empire, because they forbade observing the Torah, performing circumcision, and things like that. Because you know that the Greeks placed a lot of emphasis on the aesthetics of the body. For them, it was truly inconceivable to, let's say, mutilate the body. Circumcision is basically that, whereas Judaism sees it from a different perspective. It's not about sanctifying the body, but about sanctifying things that are much more transcendent. It's not about being led by the desire of the organ, but by greater things. Anyway. And that's why this Jewish rebellion against the impositions of this invading empire created, let's say, the social momentum for people to continue lighting candles in remembrance of this event, of these impositions that they managed to overcome. That's another perspective. It's hard to say how accurate it is, but such a proposal exists. And basically, those are the two main structural differences between the Menorah and the Hanukkiah.
Could you please tell us what the atmosphere is like right now in Israel, in your city, and in the country in general regarding the mood of this time, this Hanukkah season?
This year, much better than last year. Last year, I celebrated Hanukkah in the army and all that, but this year, Hanukkah feels a bit more, let's say, peaceful. Obviously, there's still a lot of tension because the conflict is ongoing. There are still people inside Gaza, and we hope for their release soon. But in general, Hanukkah on a social level is a holiday that is celebrated by both secular people, llamémoslos, como let's call them that, even though I don't really like these classifications, these labels. But even the least Torah observant person in Israel has a certain appreciation for celebrating Hanukkah. Because historically, since, let's say, the rebirth of Israel in the 20th century, emphasis was placed on Hanukkah because of its national focus, beyond the religious aspect. And that's what's interesting, that Hanukkah is a holiday you can see from a religious, philosophical, or spiritual angle, as many do, like light and darkness. Or you can see it as the desire of these people who want to decolonize their land again and return to their ancestral land and have independence. So the secular narrative also saw great importance in celebrating Hanukkah. That's why Hanukkah is one of the holidays with the most consensus in Israel. You can see people who are very far removed lighting the candle, even if they're far removed from Orthodox tradition, let's say. Lighting Hanukkah candles and celebrating it. Even my children in the kindergarten, right? Even though they are in a Torah kindergarten and all that, it's a holiday that you can really feel in the atmosphere. And even at the university right now, I'm doing a master's in Jewish philosophy at Ben Gurion University, and the university provides a space to light the Hanukkiah in the middle of the campus. And this is a space, keep in mind that this is during academic hours. What? Does this happen anywhere else? Only in the Jewish country. That's why you can really feel the atmosphere, and that's it.
There are Christmas trees, Santa Claus, who we call Viejito Pascuero here in Chile, and a lot of shopping. A lot of shopping, a lot of shopping, and lots of lights. That's Christmas right now. I don't know. Do you think that commercial atmosphere has increased or stayed the same?
And what's more, in Israel, in fact, at this time, I suppose those who are watching us are on vacation. The December atmosphere outside of Israel in the West is very festive. People don't work.
No.
Here in Israel, these are just normal days. Christmas, Christmas Day, New Year's, here it's just another day. Here in Israel, they're not socially established as holidays for rest or anything like that, except for certain specific populations who celebrate them. But again, these are certain Christian minorities and so on. But no, in Israel, you don't feel that atmosphere at all. It's true that there's been a shift toward the commercial side of Christmas. What I would like to mention is that there are countries, and I remember this in Colombia, where there's a tradition called, they call it the Festival of the Little Candles. And what is the Festival of the Little Candles? It's when people in Colombia light a series of candles during the period leading up to Christmas. I think it's before. Not sure if it's after, I'm not certain, but I remember people lighting candles. This is very similar to what Hanukkah is. When a Jewish person sees people lighting candles at their doors, they might think, wow, this really echoes Hanukkah. For me, the only possible explanation is that this really is an echo of the Jews expelled from Spain who had to settle in places like Colombia, Antioquia, and all these places. And that's how they celebrated, either secretly or out in the open, lighting candles and lighting candles. It's Hanukkah, and that's something that couldn't be done under the Spanish Empire. Are you a Jew or a Jew passing as a Christian and practicing Judaism? Because if not, the Inquisition will come for you. So the explanation for why you lit candles in the street was lost. But basically, I think that goes back to the Anusim. What are they called? Bnei Anusim, those who were forced by the Spanish crown to convert to Christianity. And these are Jews or crypto Jews. What are they called? I don't like the term. They're also called Marranos. In my opinion, they introduced this tradition to Colombia. So we do see that there are many variations of what is celebrated with things that have a certain form, but nowadays it's not celebrated with the same impact. It's more of a tradition now. In fact, Christmas is also just another transformation of what Saturnalia was in the Greco-Roman world and all these things. But you know, things change, things transform.
For me, I looked into Christmas and I don't think lights were that important in the past. And suddenly it was lights, lights, lights everywhere. I think it started with someone setting a Christmas tree on fire, I think, in Finland. The other day I was surprised. That was when they began putting candles on Christmas trees and everything else followed. In a way, maybe you could say that Hanukkah also had a big influence on how we celebrate Christmas in the West.
Although, actually, there's a midrash that explains this even further, let's say, as a more original source. You know, that's the point of the midrash. This is in the tractate Avodah Zarah, page 8. They say that Adam, the first man, sinned and he saw that the world started to get darker. That day was getting shorter. And Adam thought that Hashem, that God, had regretted creating the world because of Adam's sin, and that now Hashem was destroying the world because of Adam's sin. And Adam was very afraid of this. But suddenly Adam began to notice that the day was getting longer. There were more hours of daylight. Why? Because he was actually in the season, the solstice, and that's when this change happens at this time, in December. And Adam, that's why he held a celebration where he lit lanterns, candles, all of that. So what does this midrash mean? That truly, in human essence, esta necesidad, or this desire to give thanks because winter is ending. And that's why many cultures have the idea of solar festivals or festivals based on the cycles of the sun. And when the day finally gets longer, it means that winter, which is the hard part of the year, nowadays we have ovens and we have things, electricity to help us get through the winter. It wasn't so easy before. So that's why for humanity, it was very comforting to know that winter was about to end. And that's why many people celebrated these kinds of events like the Saturnalia. The Saturnalia was also celebrated around this time in December. And later they added many more depraved practices to it. I'm not going to specify what was done during the Saturnalia, but essentially it was the celebration of Saturn. About all this, that's what the Midrash says, which makes your point interesting. There is this human feeling of wanting to give thanks for the fact that Hashem helps us, even though not everyone conceives of God in the same way. And not everyone does it in a monotheistic way. But that's because human essence is expressed differently in each culture. Judaism explains this manifestation in every human festival. It explains it in such a way that, in truth, Adam's gratitude means being human. Adam is man. Man's gratitude to the Creator, basically. Well, Osvaldo, I hope the audience has learned a little, and I thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope we can see each other again in the future.
No, my thanks go to you as well. Sorry, Jacob, for accepting this invitation. It has been extremely interesting. Many new perspectives have opened up for me.